Hello, everyone. I'm Anders E.T. Hersberg, and this is the Cap and Ball Saloon, a podcast dedicated to the Second Amendment in the digital age. For today, we have a ton of topics to get through. Not only are we going to be talking about the Glock's patents that are continuing to surface, and I think I have a few more that I personally have found that you may or may not already be familiar with. We have a ton of new things going on with SIG. We have a number of rapid-fire topics, including issues with the Hearing Protection Act and the Short Act getting held up in Congress by, unfortunately, the usual traitorous suspects. And on top of that, we have a bunch of other things to go through as well. But before we get into it, a quick word about Cap and Ball. Cap and Ball Digital Strategies is a 2A-focused digital marketing agency providing organic and other digital marketing services to FFLs and others who serve the Second Amendment community. So if you'd like to know more about how we can help you grow online, visit us at capandballseo.com to see how we can help you grow your business. With that out of the way, let's get back into it. Now, our first topic today will be an overview of some of the most recent developments in SIG's continuing P320 controversy. One of the first things that I wanted to go over here was the P320 going off on their own segment from Focus Trip. He had a couple of videos that he released, including this one, where he talked about a number of issues. Focus Trip talked to what is allegedly an internal leaker. I'm not sure what kind of due diligence or anything like that was done in order to verify or vet this particular information, but for the moment, we'll take it at face value. Basically, the internal leaker summarized things as saying there is tolerance issues with different parts, including the striker safety. The striker safety apparently was originally designed to be a stamped part. However, this was moved to be a metal injection molding part. The leaker also notes that there are increased numbers of quality control checks that are going on to attempt to address these issues. But there are also differences between the 40 and the 9mm either takedown lever or magazine safety lever. And this is particularly important because this part is causing issues with sear engagement. Essentially, my understanding is that it is potentially pushing up on the slide if the wrong part has been installed for the actual firearm that you're using. If it's supposed to be a 9mm, installing the 40 Smith & Wesson one can cause problems. At least that's my current understanding of what's being alleged. And this is potentially another contributing factor to some of the uncommanded discharge issues that we have been seeing. But moving on and potentially addressing this particular fix, the SIG armor, and announcing this through Ben Stoker, allegedly is going through and is trying to make some sort of parts kit or some sort of other drop-in or easily replaceable change to attempt to address this issue. Now, originally there was supposed to be an announcement on Monday of this week. However, going on to the SIG Armor's Instagram here, we see that due to a increased amount of information, quoting, "A metric ton of new data has flooded our inbox in the last week, and we must take it all into account." So apparently the SIG Armor is delaying their formal announcement for this new product or fix that they're supposed to be coming out with. However, in the meantime, SIG has broken their silence with a hour-long interview on the Military Arms channel. Now, this is unfortunately a hour-long video that really has very little substance to it. SIG in this is still trying to blame stuff getting into the holster, and what's crazy is this video also has a tacit admission that they've been making these silent changes that they have not been formally announcing to the general public. in the P320. Another issue that has been coming up is Mac's particular stance in this whole thing, and a lot of people expected Mac to be a much stronger consumer advocate than he ultimately ended up being in this video. Now, I understand that he does want to preserve his relationship with SIG and other firearms manufacturers in general. However, I do think that there was plenty of room for Mac to be more aggressive in his questioning and his rhetoric with the SIG representative shown here in this video. However, there are even more problems that are coming to light that SIG is currently dealing with as well, not just with the P320, but also the XM7 rifle as well. I'm sure a number of you are already familiar with the report that has been going around. However, they're also facing a lawsuit over the XM7 rifle in general. From Defense News, here we have this article talking about how True Velocity and its sister company Lone Star Future Weapons are suing Sig-Sauer, alleging stolen company trade secrets. Now, I have looked at some of the information from this particular lawsuit and some of the claims that are being made. It is a little bit interesting, the claims of IP rights and intellectual property being stolen by SIG through the mechanism of aggressively recruiting GDOTS employees who had spent years designing and developing these technologies and obtaining crucial and highly confidential design data. Now, the problem with this that I see inherently is that when it comes to a non-compete agreement specifically for employees in these very technical fields, where it might be next to impossible for an employee to find a gainful employment if they are let go in the same field that they're already experienced in, if they stay with this non-compete agreement that they've already signed, a lot of courts more and more are having a hard time backing up these particular non-compete agreements. And I think while there are other claims, this particular claim of using the former employees to steal intellectual property rights from True Velocity is probably going to be one of the more difficult claims to uphold, simply because it's kind of cruxed on these non-compete agreements, and Sig-Sauer is saying, hey, we hired these people after you either fired them or demoted them. So this is yet another case that we're going to have to keep an eye on and see how it plays out for Sig-Sauer. Now, it's not just lawsuits that Sig-Sauer is seeing the XM7 rifle have difficulties with. As I mentioned previously, there is also the report that has come out, and I first actually saw this report from Daniel Waters, who is a historian who was actually mentioned and cited in the report for his work on the history of the 5.56 and the AR-15's development timeline. Now, if we look at the report itself, there were a number of different places here that I kind of wanted to point out and note as we go through here. I think this is probably the core argument here. The XM7 rifle reflects a philosophy favoring long-range, large-caliber, semi-automatic rifles to enable engagements beyond 500 meters. Known as gravel bellies, believers of this school of thought evaluate weapon performance on static rifle ranges without consideration for the combat conditions a rifleman is expected to perform in. Evidence of the failure of this concept can be found in the M14, America's shortest serving service rifle. The heavy, large-caliber M14 was quickly replaced with the small-caliber, lightweight M16. Disturbingly, the XM7 shares a great deal of characteristics with the ill-fated M14 design. And personally, as someone who has taken a look at a fair amount of the information surrounding the development of the 5.56 cartridge and its ultimate purpose and role within a warfighting capabilities, I have to agree on this fundamental premise that the XM7 is just the next version of the M14. And while it may make a very good designated marksman's rifle or squad sniper, or whatever these specific nomenclature is being used, I think that it is not a appropriate replacement for the general issue rifle, at least at this time. But let's continue to go through the report and see some of the other things that have been brought up by it. Most of this beginning section we'll skip through because it's basically just one long history lesson. However, if we get to this bit here, which is a little bit more modern, this does give us the rationale and the reasoning behind the initial development of the XM7 rifle. Quote, however, combat experiences in Afghanistan created concerns about the ability of an individual squad to engage targets at distance. American troops were being engaged well outside of typical rifle range, at distances greater than 500 meters. The small, high-velocity 5.56 ammunition was having limited effect at that distance. Medium machine guns like the 7.62 NATO, M240, specialized snipers, indirect and guided munitions were able to close this gap in lethality. Most significantly, a specialized role was added to each squad to provide additional standoff range, the designated marksman. Officially introduced into the Army in 2002, the role of designated marksman is to engage enemy automatic rifle teams, anti-tank teams, and snipers using precision fires. End quote. Now we continue on with some other information here. However, let's see. One of the other things that is being talked about is the amount of pressure that's built up in the system. This is something that can be of great concern. Now, for the US military, who has basically a blank check, very good in general logistics, the service life of a weapon system, be it a rifle or a pistol, might not be all that important. However, there are still concerns about making sure that that service life is within acceptable ranges and can be used effectively and not have to create some sort of situation where the individual soldier is concerned that their firearm is going to break down on them during sustained or even just general use. Again, quoting from the report here, this means that to achieve greater velocity, the XM7 must also create higher pressures. Traditional brass-cased ammunition cannot be safely used in a system with such high pressures, leading to the creation of a proprietary steel-brass hybrid case. Higher peak pressures require stronger and heavier components to maintain safety and reliability. Higher peak pressures also increase the risk of parts wearing out quickly. Higher muzzle exit pressure makes the weapon louder and may require the use of a suppressor to maintain acceptable noise and blast exposure. The need to always install a suppressor negates the benefit in size, weight, and balance that a short barrel is intended to provide. And continuing on here, SAMI's report on the 6.8 hybrid ammunition states that this ammunition has a maximum average pressure of 80,000 psi. This report includes a warning: maximum average pressure levels greater than 65,000 psi may present increased risk of unsafe cartridge case or firearm rupture, thus requiring cartridge case and or firearms designs that depart from traditional practices. Now, that is very much the point of the 277 Fury's hybrid case design. However, with that said, we already do have a hybrid case design on the market that utilizes a nickel alloy two-piece design very much similar to what the 277 Fury uses from Shell Shock Technologies. The NAS3 case is very much the same style, but uses slightly different materials. In the case of the wall itself, it uses, as I said, a nickel material, an alloy, and then for the base of the case, in the case of the pistol cartridges, it uses an aluminum, and in the case of the rifle cartridges, they're using a steel base case. Now, from my limited experience with this particular case, if you will, this brass case alternative from Shell Shock, as well as talking with some others people online who have had experience with them as well. They seem to hold up to not only the higher pressures, but also do not have need for resizing or reforming like a traditional brass case would. Now, of course, there are going to be no free lunches in terms of, materials designs and things like that. Everything is going to be some sort of a trade-off. However, I wonder if, because this particular solution already existed, that SIG had to basically copy Shellshock's homework and come up with their own idea in order to handle the requirements. And it's not like the Shellshock technology is not capable of being a drop-in replacement for the existing weapon systems that are already on the market. They already have a wide range of 9mm as well as 5.56, 308, as well as a number of other cartridges that they are currently developing or working with ammunition manufacturers directly to develop and create loadings for. And a lot of these loadings, looking around at what's available on the market, these are pretty hot and heavy loadings that are running at basically plus P plus style pressures. Essentially, you could be seeing a situation where these new cartridges could take off and become more popular with these higher pressure loadings. However, to accommodate for this, you might see changes in the build of the barrel extension, the bolt in, say, like an AR-15 style platform. Conversely, for standard like 9mm pistols, you do also have quite a bit of weight savings. If I hold a box of standard 9mm ammo next to the box of Shellshock brass that I still have sitting around from when I was initially playing and testing around with these particular ammunition designs, the difference in just felt weight is substantial. So there is definitely something here, and I think this is a technology that the Army really should be looking at for a version 2 of the next generation weapons program. But hey, what do I know? Now, continuing on in the report, if we go a little bit farther, we also see some discussion of things like ergonomics, the weight of the weapon system, and things like that. Quoting again here from the report, however, the light weight of the stock and side folding mechanism mean that more felt weight is transferred to the front of the rifle in combination with the gas system. This means that the XM7 feels more front heavy. Again, this is something that the XM7 has as an inherent design problem because it is a piston system, not being a direct impingement system. It is more easily able to mount a folding style of stock. However, that also means that they are making the whole thing much more front heavy, and that is something that is noted in this particular report and continues to be noted by the troops who are actually using this thing on a regular basis. But it's not just the front heavy nature of it, it is also the overall weight as well. If we continue on here in the report, it says, quote, "The weight of the XM7 rifle is one of the most significant departures from the M4A1. The unloaded M4 weighs 6.5 pounds, while the unloaded XM7 without the suppressor is just over 8 pounds. Once the SLX suppressor is added, that goes up to almost 10 pounds, 9.84 pounds. This is a total weight increase of over 3 pounds over the M4A1. This difference is further exaggerated when the XM7's heavier ammunition, magazines, and optics are all added to the scale. A complete, unloaded XM7 rifle issued to soldiers weighs 13.26 pounds, significantly heavier than even the Vietnam-era M14. Now, moving down, it's not just the weight that is also an issue, it's also the accuracy. Previously, when some of the P320 issues were starting to come to light, The Art and War podcast had a episode dedicated specifically to the issues with the P320, as well as a report documenting a number of issues with the P320, the P365, as well as the Sig Spear, which is basically the civilian derivative of the XM7 rifle. And similar issues with accuracy were also noted in that particular report. And going back to the XM7 report here, we see that 3 to 6 MOA on evaluated XM7 rifles. Test data from a significant quantities of XM7s now in service is not yet publicly available, however. But 3 to 6 MOA is pretty bad. The baseline standard for this rifle is supposed to be no more than 4 MOA. And most civilian shooters really aren't going to be happy with a rifle in this particular price point that isn't doing 1 to 2 MOA easily out of the box. Now, moving down, we do also see more issues with potentially with the ammunition and that high pressure loading that it is using. Noting here, in all examined rifles, the wear occurred on the bottom side of the barrel in the same area. It's about 4 inches back from the crown of the barrel and just behind the gas port here. And if we scroll down further, we can also see what the bolt is starting to look like after use and wear. On the left here, we see a used bolt, and then on the right here, we see a brand new bolt. Enhanced view of the used bolt. Note the wear to the extractor. Protective coating has worn to the point that bare metal is visible, and the previous 90-degree edge has been worn to almost 45 degrees. Again, this is probably indicating that different materials and different construction need to be used in the barrel extension as well as the bolt itself to prevent these kinds of issues if we are going to be running such hot, high-pressure ammunition. There really is a give and take. Yes, we are getting more velocity, we are getting more energy and impact downrange, but we are also losing a fair amount of parts life and durability. And it's not just the barrel itself, there's also potentially issues with the SLX suppressor. As noted here, the mounting system seems to have problems with it as well, potentially leading to catastrophic damage to the suppressor, like what is shown in the image here in this report. Now, if we move on further into the report, we do also see a number of other things that came out of these military exercises that were conducted. Going back to the report here, quote, the author observed gunfighter company C-1506 during their daytime iteration of a combined arms live-fire exercise, or CALFEX. The soldiers had already conducted a dry and blank iteration of the CALFEX and were well versed in battle drills needed to succeed. The platoon, the author observed, was tasked with providing suppression of the object in order to enable the maneuver of the other platoons in the company. 10 minutes after making contact with the enemy, the volume of fire of the platoon was able to output was insufficient. After 15 minutes, the platoon was almost completely out of ammunition for rifles, light machine guns, and medium machine guns. By this point, spare XM7 magazines had already been taken from soldiers not on the firing line. Platoon leadership, radio operator, medic, etc. Now, this may indicate that a change needs to be made to the basic loadout and the number of magazines that are being carried by each individual soldier. But that's also going to translate to increased weight as well being carried. So either that means they're going to be strapping even more weight to the soldiers, or kit needs to be taken out in the soldiers' basic loadout in other places. And I'm not entirely sure if that's going to be possible. Now, moving on, we do also see that there are other reasons why we have moved to small caliber, high velocity rounds like the 5.56. If we go back to the report, we actually see here a comparison between a quote-unquote light and a heavy weapon system. Time to first shot, time to follow-up shot, and overall hit factor have tangible impacts on the battlefield performance. These results are corroborated by similar testing done at the Weapons Training Battalion. If we look here in these tables, we see that when it comes to time to first shot, no matter either 100 or 300 range, split time, and hit factor all weigh in favor of the light 5.56 style solution. And if we go over here to hit probability, we see that only in the factors of a destroyed head or hitting the chest do we see a slight advantage go towards the heavy solution. However, given that all of the other factors outweigh in favor of the light 5.56 style solution versus the 7.62 style solution, I think it would be fair to say that for most purposes, it probably makes more sense to be defaulting to a 5.56 style cartridge. Now, if we continue on, we can also see some of the ergonomics issues that were also brought up in the report. Here we see a photo showing a soldier attempting to charge the rifle using the charging handle here at the rear. Quote, "To avoid hitting the stock, soldiers must pull up and out on the charging handle to lock the bolt fully. It was also reported that pulling the charging handle up and out with too much force had the potential to break it. Other reported problems with the rifle include ambidextrous magazine release, handguard retaining mechanism, and issued sling. The author recommends a thorough investigation into the causes of these issues with the goal of improving the XM7 rifle." Now, the current existing systems, such as the M4A1, do have their own capabilities that could potentially bridge the gap between what the XM7 is trying to accomplish and what the current standard issue M4A1 is capable of doing. If we go back to the report, we see a section here talking about the Russo-Ukrainian War. Quote, "Specifically, the M955 armor-piercing 5.56 is preferred for the ease at which it can penetrate body armor. The use of black-tip M955 armor-piercing 5.56 ammunition does not have a significant effect on the reliability of the rifles being used. Additional open-source data on the conflict has confirmed the ineffectiveness of Russian body armor as well as the reality of infantry engagements below 300 meters. These findings are just one small data point from the war, but what is clear is that the basic principles of infantry combat have not changed." Now, if we expand this particular concern out to other near-peer potential adversaries, i.e. China, there is, at least in my understanding currently, very little reason to believe that China has significantly higher body armor capabilities than the Russian forces that are currently fighting in Ukraine. So again, we see another situation where it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to make the XM7 rifle be the standard issue rifle for all infantry. And going above and beyond just the ammunition, there are other things that have been done within the civilian market to improve the accuracy of the AR-15 pattern rifle. If we go back into the report, we see this. Special operations, notably Army Special Forces, have adopted upgraded variants of the M4A1. Variations add free-floated barrels for greater accuracy, improved gas systems for reliability, and suppressors for reduced operator signature. Advanced magnified optics and laser aiming devices increase the range at which operators can engage targets. These upgrades support the original intent of the M4A1 and the battlefield philosophy behind its use. Special Operations Forces supplemented the modified M4A1s with rifles developed for long-range aimed fires, the designated marksman rifles. Concerns about penetration of body armor at distances beyond 300 meters could be in part mitigated by the use of M955 AP 5.56 ammunition. M955 is already in DoD inventory and can be produced in greater quantities. While currently uncommon for use with rifles, further developments of tungsten core penetrators in 5.56 projectiles have the potential to further increase the terminal ballistic performance of the M4A1. And it's not just the 5.56 that tungsten is being looked at for use in a specialized role. The Norma Adler ADLER 12 gauge shell that I've actually talked about previously is using a tungsten matrix in a number 6 size shot pellet in their particular loading in order to effectively deal with and potentially engage drones at distances, I believe it was up to 50 odd meters. If you want to read the full report, I'll link to it in the description below for this video. The XM7 rifle, while on paper does seem like an impressive step forward in terms of modern warfighting capabilities. However, once again, like with many other military programs, we see that on paper doesn't always translate to actual effectiveness in the battlefield. Therefore, I really do think that the US military does need to consider whether or not it's worth it to be investing all of this time and effort into a completely brand new rifle for everyone in the military when smaller, more incremental upgrades could be issued and give them, if not 80 to 90%, if not more, of the same effect that they are looking for out of the XM7 rifle. However, that is just my personal opinion based on what I've been able to find. I would encourage you to leave your thoughts on the XM7 rifle and the Sig-Sauer P320 in the comments section below. But let's move on to our next set of topics. So, going through a number of rapid-fire topics here, we'll start out with somebody, unfortunately, trying to impersonate Paul Harrell. So, about 9 days ago, as the time of this recording, Roy posted a message here on the Paul Harrell YouTube channel. Quote, I am forced to make this post to protect Paul's legacy and this channel. There is a recent new channel called Paul Harrell's Nephew. Let me make this clear. He is not related to my brother, the famous YouTuber Paul Harrell, in any way. He admits so in a video. This does not, however, stop him from using the misleading channel name, stealing videos, etc., etc. It's unfortunate, but unfortunately, Paul was right about what was going to happen. Some people are going to be trying to take advantage of his name. Another interesting thing that I saw pop up rather recently is this image floating around on Twitter. This is a 545 and a 762 by 54 new cartridge design. Honestly, this thing looks like it was meant to go into the SPEW program. This looks very much like the 22-06 duplex cartridges that were being experimented with in a few different rifles during the early years of the SPEW and Salvo projects. Basically, the idea was to get more bullets in the air with a single trigger pull. And it looks like the Russians are trying to do the exact same thing here with this particular cartridge case design. Now, I've previously already talked about attempts to take small buckshot and put them in either heat shrink, plastic tubing, or in 3D printed sabots, and put those into a standard 545 or 762 by 54 case, and use those as anti-drone ammo. It seems like this is the next evolution of that particular concept, where we see a much more formal, stacked bullet style of design. I'm not entirely sure how effective these are going to be. Battlefield conditions, testing, and reports and things like that have been somewhat limited so far, at least for what I've been able to get my hands on, so who knows, this could be a meme, this could be actually effective. I guess only time will tell. Drones really have kind of changed things up, and thus far the really only practical solution that I've seen thus far that I look at and say, that might actually work is, again, Norma's Adler shell, that 12 gauge tungsten load using number 6 shot. But other than that, I just thought that this was a curious development of things coming all the way back around. And of course, it seems that the firearms industry at large has a hard time understanding technology in general. I'm honestly not sure what to make of this. This right here is the Korth Bitcoin Revolver. I have no idea why they thought that this was going to be a good idea. This thing is interesting. Apparently they're only going to be making a few hundred of these and then destroying the tooling once they're done with this limited production run. I guess it's supposed to have like a accompanying EFT that goes along with it. Basically, it sounds like somebody in the marketing department heard every single buzzword and has spent the past 5-6 years trying to convince Korth to utilize those buzzwords in some sort of limited edition product. And they're probably about 3 to 5 years too late in coming to market with something like this, if it was ever even a viable product to begin with. But hey, it has a whole bunch of gold in it. At $84,000, I'm not entirely sure that this is a product for me. I don't have Saudi oil money, so if you do, let me know if you like this particular revolver and want to pick one of this limited edition up. And for our next rapid fire topic, we'll be talking about Trump's big, beautiful bill and how, in my opinion, it is not quite so big nor quite so beautiful. Now, this particular bill was supposed to include language from both the Hearing Protection Act as well as the Short Act. Basically, both of these would remove the short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, as well as other NFA items such as suppressors from the NFA. The Hearing Protection Act was supposed to do that, and the Short Act was supposed to do that same thing for short-barreled rifles, shotguns, etc. However, it looks like the usual suspects in the House Ways and Means Committee, a Republican-controlled committee, have decided that they are going to take the Hearing Protection Act and gut it, and then completely ignore the Short Act as well. Currently, the bill only has this following information, or text in it, saying that there shall be levied on firearms transferred a tax at the rate of $5 for each firearm transferred. In the case of a weapon classified as any other weapon, $0 for a firearm classified as a silencer, and $200 for any other firearms transferred. So this leaves the current short-barreled rifle, short-barreled shotgun taxes in place, leaves suppressors on a national registry, and only really makes it for $5 for any other weapons. Why? Like, we have the numbers to make this happen, to remove these from the NFA and get stuff like this done. But unfortunately, it seems like the usual suspects don't want to make this happen. Quoting from the guns.com article here, quote, "This isn't a compromise, it's a betrayal," said Eric Pratt, Senior Vice President of Gun Owners of America. The House Ways and Means Committee chose to leave unconstitutional registration and taxes in place, even though they had a clear path to repeal them. GOA made it crystal clear that the full deregulation of suppressors and protection for brace owners was achievable under reconciliation. Lawmakers knew it, and they chose political convenience over principle. Gun owners won't forget this. I certainly won't either. Now, this is to say that we aren't completely without hope. Because of the point at which this bill currently sits, it still has to go through a number of other voting processes, so it is entirely possible that it can be lobbied for this language to be added back into the bill before finally being passed. Given the fact that this is an omnibus bill with multiple different things going on inside of it, it's entirely possible that we could get this language that we are looking for back into this bill and make it happen. My only advice for you would be to call up your current Congress critter and let them know that you support seeing a return for the language from the Short Act as well as the Hearing Protection Act back into Trump's one big beautiful bill, so it can be one big beautiful bill yet again. And for our final rapid fire topic for this episode, we have a rather interesting kind of sneak peek behind the curtains when it comes to how self-defense cases actually end up running. Now, this is a expert testimony statement from John Correa of the Active Self-Protection YouTube channel, as well as Active Self-Protection Extra. On his channel, both of them, he has been documenting this case and the fallout from this case. But this particular report does give you kind of an inside look at what a expert testimony looks like, the kind of things that they are considering in these use of force cases. And in this particular case, where a dog was charging an elderly man as well as his own dog, the elderly individual drew a revolver and defended himself from the dog who was charging him. And this report goes into all of the different experimental data, all of the different reaction times, shows in process how little time there is to react and assess such a situation fully, and how in this particular situation, the elderly gentleman was reasonably in fear for his life. Now, fortunately, due it probably in large part to this kind of expert testimony, the defendant, the person who had to defend themselves in this particular situation, was eventually acquitted of all of the charges by a jury. However, it was still quite frightening how such a relatively clear case of lawful self-defense against a charging animal could turn into such a massive case. Now, not only did Active Self-Protection also post this particular expert witness report, but also a full-length video of the defendant and his interrogation with the police. And you can see in this interrogation a number of different ways how the police attempted to fabricate things, put words into the defender's mouth, and try to make the narrative fit their preconceived conceptions about what happened. I think this is interesting viewing and something that people should be aware of if they are going to carry and be potentially in a situation where they have to defend themselves or their loved ones with the use of deadly force. These kinds of things can and will happen where the police decide they have their own preconceived theory of what happened. They're going to try and make you agree to that, and they're going to use every trick in the book to make that happen. But that wraps up all of our rapid fire topics for today's episode. If you have any thoughts, comments about any specific one, let me know in the comment section below. If you have any other topics that you'd like to see us cover, comment with those below and we'll try and sneak them into the next episode. We are currently trying to hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, so if you could like, share, subscribe, we'd really love it because we want to grow Cap and Ball on YouTube and spread our message of promoting the Second Amendment in the digital age. Now, on to our next topic. So, about almost 3 years ago, we had a rather interesting leak come out. From this AmmoLand article, there was a Glock carbine that was seen, and Glock was kind of quiet about this, except for one very small statement. Quote, Glock is always in development of future products and technologies through the pursuit of perfection. Ansley Cash Connor, communications manager for Glock, told AmmoLand News. The image shared is of a product developed for select solicitations and is not available in the general market at this time. That is rather interesting. And while we haven't heard anything, I'm wondering, and this is completely wild, totally unfounded speculation on my part, if their recent cancellations of a number of older pistols don't herald in something new coming to the market. Now, granted, I do think it is far, far more likely that we are going to see some kind of a Gen 6, and I've done a bunch of coverage talking about the various patents that Glock is currently sitting on that could potentially be leveraged for a Gen 6 style of pistol. However, conversely, or maybe even at the same time, Glock could take this rifle that they have done an actually quite fair amount of work developing and launch that along with or instead of a completely brand new Gen 6. Anything is possible, and what is going to follow is going to be a whole bunch of wild, completely baseless speculation. However, all of these patents that I am going to show you are specifically for this rifle or something related to it. And the amount of work that Glock has put into this particular carbine is impressive. So, let me show you what they've been sitting on. We're going to rapid fire through all of these different patents. Most of them are not too terribly exciting in their in isolation. However, some of them do have movement on them as recently as 2025 and were filed as recently as just a couple of years ago. So, first one, we have a dust cover for an AR-15 style rifle that you see there. We have a gas-operated firearm with adjustable pressure selector. A design for a gas-powered firearm, nothing too terribly crazy. And then we have a firearm with gas-operated reloading mechanism. We have a firearm with a magazine holder, trigger unit for a firearm, a trigger guard. This you can actually see if we go back to, if we actually go back to it, it looks like that is the same style of trigger guard there that they have patented here, or if not, very similar. Then we have a buttstock for a firearm. Now, this particular one, I wouldn't be super excited for or anything like that, but what is interesting is this was initially submitted back in mid-2024 and has activity on it as recently as April of this year. So, if nothing else, Glock is still doing something with this particular rifle. Maybe it is, as previously claimed, that we are just looking at something for select solicitations, but Glock, to be perfectly honest with you, why would you just leave something like this as a select solicitation only rifle? You could sell gangbusters in the US market. But moving on, they also have a patent for a end plate sling adapter. There's a barrel assembly for a firearm, and this one is from 2024 as well. They have a whole firearm upper receiver design, a bolt for a firearm, secondary handguard mount, and this one also has a activity as recently as late 2024 with a patent grant. Rifle comprising a bolt catch device, firearm with secured firing pin retaining pin, say that 5 times fast, carbine with charging handle assembly, bolt catch design, a barrel for a firearm with locking space and a production process, connection for the upper receiver part and lower receiver part of a firearm, charging handle for a firearm, safety selector designed for a breech block, an adapter for mounting an accessory on a firearm, which again is rather similar to what we saw previously. This guy right here. And then we also have a firearm with an improved barrel connection. And finally, we have a firearm with a improved barrel connection patent. Now, does this mean that we will see this particular rifle show up on the US market or in any market? Who knows? It's entirely possible that Glock wants to keep this as just for specific and select solicitations. However, with this amount of R&D work, if they get any kind of tooling up and running, it would be kind of silly for them to not to try and take advantage of the US market and build rifles for the US market, especially when you have High Point and others going into the rifle game as well. Or we could see a situation like the Glock 46, where we have an interesting and really cool design that honestly never sees the light of day except for a handful of copies in German police hands, I believe is where the Glock 46 ultimately ended up going. But of course, all of this is completely wild speculation. Now, do you think that it's entirely possible that Glock ends up entering into the rifle market? Let me know in the comments section below. And finally, for our last topic of today, I wanted to show off a few more patents that Glock has related to pistols and potentially a few more things that could be dropped into that Glock Gen 6. I have continued to dig around and find a few more patents for them. Now, these aren't quite nearly as interesting as the modular grip design or the change in takedown design. However, these are somewhat interesting. One of them here is for a firearm including an extractor assembly. Then the next one is for a trigger assembly, somewhat slightly different. A multifunctional slide cover plate. Now, what's interesting about this is it might address some of the issues that Glock has with the Glock switch. Now, to truly be able to change up the firing mechanism and fully prevent the current iterations of a Glock switch would take much more than just a changed out firing plate. But I'm wondering if they didn't work on this particular patent in order to address some of those concerns more easily than trying to retool their entire firing mechanism and slide assembly. But who knows? Then we have an interesting patent here for a recoil spring abutment for a slide of a modular handgun specifically. Now, this particular one was initially filed for in 2022 and has just some basic information as of January 2025. Granting procedure in general, so it looks like it's just kind of sitting there at the moment, not really doing anything. I don't see granted status or anything like that, so who knows if this is something that they want to actually leverage. But it is rather interesting that they are looking at some additional designs for the recoil spring assembly. And finally, we do also have a slide and frame for a pistol equipped with the slide and the frame. Say that 5 times fast. Best name for a patent ever, Glock. But hey, who knows? Maybe all of these or maybe none of these will actually end up going into a Glock Gen 6 pistol. Only time will tell, and of course, all I can really do is sit here, show off some of these patents that I found, and do a little bit of theorizing about what Glock might have up their sleeve in the coming months and years. But if you have any thoughts about these particular patents, let me know in the comments below. Now, I do want to thank you all for hanging around and watching this episode of the Cap and Ball Saloon. Hopefully you found it informative and entertaining. We are trying to grow. Our current goal is to hit 1,000 subscribers. So if you can like, share, and comment for me, that would be absolutely amazing. I appreciate every single one of you, and I do try to get down into the comments as frequently as possible to catch up and respond to everyone who leaves a comment. But until next time, I'm Anders E.T. Herzberg for the Cap and Ball Saloon, hoping to see you all again real soon.